Hey everybody, so in this lesson we're going to go over using web services. So I know originally we had planned to go over collection views, but in talking to some local companies a few weeks ago, we heard that web services is a big deal. It's how all the companies are sending data back and forth to the app. So we decided to add this web services lesson to the schedule. So minor schedule change, and I'm just going to create a couple quick videos to go over the book example. It does a pretty good job. I think it's a little complicated in how it forms the URL, so I'm just going to do a slightly simplified version with just the URL put together so you can see what that looks like. And at the very beginning of your chapter, it does show the entire URL put together. And then okay, so we'll use two videos. This first one's just going to do a little bit of setup. I'll add the UI image view, and I'll just get started with some of the code, and then I'll finish up in the second video, just so the videos aren't too long. Okay, so first of all, basically what we're going to do is we're going to send a web service request up to Flickr's web server, and a web service is basically just a way to expose methods on a web server. So imagine or think about, I guess, creating a class and you have methods in it, and then you can kind of mark the methods, depending on what language you're using, you can mark the method as available remotely. So when we call a web service, basically what we're going to do is we're going to send a request, typically an HTTPS request, to a web server. It's going to have a URL specific to a path to this class that sits on the web server. The web server is going to take in this request, and as part of the request, we're going to call a specific method. So then we could have parameters that we send to that method, and typically what we get back from the method is data, and that data more often than not is stored in JSON. And JSON is JavaScript object notation. So if you are familiar with JavaScript, basically an object in JavaScript is created almost like an array with labels. And so what we're going to have is we're going to have a JavaScript array of JavaScript objects. That's the data that we're going to get back from. Or we might just get back a single JavaScript object if it's not multiple data that we're trying to retrieve. Okay, so let's get to it here. So I just created a simple app. Let's add an image view. So just open up the library, focus on the right window here, and I'm just going to constrain it so it fills the whole view. And we'll need to connect it to our view controller code. So I'll create a private variable, just call it image view, just like our book example. It's image view. And so now we've got an outlet defined as image view. So connected, I'm just going to right click on the view controller and drag image view, our outlet image view, down to our storyboard UI image view object, and now they're connected. So now we can access this UI image view from our view controller code. And as I mentioned, when we get back data from the web service, it's going to be an array of objects. So let's create a class called photo. And when we want to take JSON and convert it into Swift code and take a value from JSON and make it represent a class with properties in our Swift code, we would decode the JSON. And we want to send data to our web server, or for creating a web service, we want to take our data stored in a class or variables, and we want to encode it. So this is a codable class. We'll be able to convert back and forth. So these are some of the properties that are returned from our web service. So we've got a title for just describing what the image is. We have a URL, and the URL is a string that points to an image path on the Flickr web server. A photo ID, so each one of our photos has a unique ID. And finally, date. So it's just a string with a date that's returned from the web server as to when the picture was taken. Okay. All right. So I created the code already. I'm not going to sit here and type it in. You guys don't want to watch me do that. So I'll just put the code in. I'm just going to go to the view did load method, and you can see I put the URL here, and here's the code I'm going to use. So you can see that I used a slightly more simplified version of the code where I just put the URL into a string. I definitely encourage you to follow the book and use their code. This will be fine for this example though. So this is all the code that we need, and basically URL session, that's how we're going to create a connection to the web server. We've got this data task, so we're going to try to send a request to the web server using this URL object, and what we're going to get back is data, a response, and an error code if there's any error codes that exist. So we're going to set this variable JSON data equal to the data that was returned, and we want to implement it with this if. So if we get data back, we want to say if let JSON string. Then we want to encode it with UTF-8 as a standard, and then we want to print it. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is we're going to send this URL, and we're going to handle it, the response, and we're going to take the data and set it to this JSON data object, and then we're going to make it a string. We're going to take this JSON data and we're going to encode it. I think I said it backwards before. We're going to encode it using UTF-8 as the standard. And so now we have this JSON string, which is just a string representation of not a variable that's sent back, or not one value inside of the JSON object or one of the objects inside the array. But this is a string of everything that was sent back, just basically the raw response. So we're just encoding the entire thing. So we're just going to print that to the console. And then if there's an error, we can display the error. And if something unexpected happened, we're just going to say unexpected error. Okay, so if I run this, we should get back. Should send a request. We're not using the photo class yet, but it's not going to display anything. But if we go look at our console, what we'll see is we did get back the response. So this is what the JSON looks like, and there's a lot of images in this JSON array. So this is kind of the overall some data about what's sent back, and then here's each photo. So you can see what it is basically just an array, but it has labels to identify. So this is considered the ID property. Here's the ID for the first image. And then there's a lot of data that we're not going to use. So let me jump to title. So here's the title, and then a colon separates. This is the key value pair. So here's the key is title, and this is the value, sensation, exclamation, exclamation, exclamation. And here is the URL, URLZ, and you can see that it's a string to an image on a web server, and if we pop this URL, even I think the browser even recognizes these escape sequences. You can take those out if you want. But we can take this URL and pop it into the address bar of our browser, and you should see an image file for each of these. And then we've got a height and a width, and then here's date taken, so you can see all the values. Here's the date taken value, so you see it's a timestamp with the date and a time. And that's it. That's the JSON data that's returned. So now we've taken this data and we've gotten it into this JSON string, and we've printed it to the console. So we know that we can make a request using a URL object, and this URL session data task is going to try to fetch some data. We know that we've now connected to the web server. We've requested some data. We've got it back in a response, and data was returned from the method, and we've gotten into this JSON string using UTF-8 standard, and we printed it to the console. So there you go. There's a start, and in a follow-up video, we're going to try to take this JSON string and parse it so that we get an array of excuse me, we can actually get to these values: title, remote URL, photo ID, and date taken, not data taken, for each of our images. Okay, thanks.